Yeah, show the pictures and everything.
Probably can't fix that. Probably like 9 years old now, so.
There's a break.
Yeah, it is. Oh, no, tell me, no one used to see this.
Much better.
That's all. I was watching YouTube die and see back up. Yeah, they're looking at this. Like if you're watching this or something. Oh. Yeah, we do it too, but. I know, right? Like now there's no role for any. In the data. They used to make us like. So you make that one camera. Yeah, no, like.
They can show. He's gone. I know. Let's see. Thanks. Awesome. Thank you, everyone.
Good afternoon, thank you, student. Okay, good afternoon and welcome back to docket number 230832, the application of the Connecticut Water Company to amend its rate schedules. We're here this afternoon for oral argument in this matter. I'd like to begin by taking appearances of the attorneys that intend to participate in oral argument this afternoon on behalf of their clients. We do require formal appearances to be filed in the docket, which I know everyone has complied with, but for purposes of knowing who I'm calling up today, I would appreciate if every attorney who intends to participate would approach the microphone. Well, if I could start with the company, please. Oh, camera view.
Thank you, Mr. Fumpin. Good afternoon, Chairman Gillette. For the record, David Bogan from the law firm of Day Pitney on behalf of the Connecticut Water Company. If the chair will allow, the company's CEO, Craig Patlett, will also be making a few comments.
Of course. Thank you. Consumer Counsel or OCC, please.
Good afternoon, Chairman Gillette. Andrew Minikowski on behalf of the Office of Consumer Counsel. I am joined this afternoon by my colleague, Allison McCorney, as well as the Consumer Counsel, Claire Coleman. Thank you.
Thank you. Attorney Wright, please.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Chairman Gillette. John Wright on behalf of the Attorney General.
Thank you. Is Attorney Nigro, please.
Good afternoon. Susanna Nigro on behalf of the Department of Energy and Environmental Protection, and I'll be joined here today by Eric Ennis, who is a staff member of the department.
Thank you. Attorney Richter, are you, oh, over there, all the way. Thank you.
Good afternoon, man. Joel Dichter, Dichter Law on behalf of the Heritage Village Master Association. Thank you.
Thank you. And EOE. Please.
Brittany Wyman on behalf of the Office of Education, Outreach, and Enforcement.
Thank you. Am I missing anyone? Okay, in that case, since the company has affirmatively requested oral argument, I will invite Attorney Bogan and Mr. Patlaw to the podium in whichever order you wish.
Thank you, Chair Gillette, and to all the participants and stakeholders that have been involved with this proceeding to determine the means by which Connecticut Water will serve its customers now and into the next piece of future for us. When we were here before you all in January, I committed to you at that point that Connecticut Water would be a transparent and open partner in the pursuit of a balanced approach to serve our customers, our employees, communities, the environment, and yes, shareholders. That pursuit would have the necessary tension to arrive at the best answers for all the stakeholders tied to this proceeding. I must admit, I stand here today somewhat disillusioned. I had faith in the process despite what was said in the press or what we were hearing from our capital providers on the heels of the two previous decisions that were before this authority. I know the merit of our requests in the proceeding was justified and prudent, and that we'd certainly collectively get there to the right answer. But within 174 pages of the draft decision, the author of which describes this proceeding as, and I quote, an adversarial process in which the company's lawyers and experts advocate for a rate case outcome that best serves the company's shareholders rather than ratepayers. I found that somewhat confounding. Was that this proceeding? An adversarial process. I believe we lived up to our commitment to the authority to be that transparent, willing partner in pursuit of the answer. That belief had and has been validated multiple times over the conduct, content, and in the months following the hearings. I find that statement to be wholly untrue and somewhat offensive to our 244 employees who, without exception and collectively, we all see ourselves as public advocates for the health and safety of the people and the communities that we serve, period. The assumption that we are singularly out for the benefit of the shareholders at the expense of customers is a straight violation to very core values and beliefs and stands in stark contradiction to what our customers say about us. Just recently, we've received our quarterly customer satisfaction results, and our field staff rated a 97% satisfaction level, which is an amazing number and stands in contradiction to what we see here. A combination amongst the parties should be, and I've said this in my opening statements, delivering life-sustaining, high-quality water and exceptional service while protecting the environment, enhancing our communities, and providing a fair return on the necessary investments. We should collectively go back to and reference that mission statement as we seek balance amongst those stakeholders it references and it represents in the determination of what will be the final decision here. You see, the balance, in that balance lies the answer. Too much favor or conversely detriment to any of the stakeholders causes a loss of that balance and will ultimately lead to failure. Too much focus on investors obviously inflates the revenue requirement request and ignores affordability. Too much focus on cost reduction short-sights the necessity of investment to take on the challenges facing the water industry, including water quality and reliability, and so on and so on. The challenges are never ending. The how of these proceedings have been the subject of our debate and clarifications. We undoubtedly share a common why. Now, I've been around a while. In old days, a company would come in with a stated request, receive half as normal course, and be on its way. I've always thought that a bit strange and weird, and was just as happy to not have to participate in that process. It just seemed to be a slap to the integrity of all parties involved. I knew I would not do well in that world, yet here I am. Thinking it can be different, and I believe that. We did not consider this proceeding to be anything similar to those days. We took our cues from the previous two decisions. We thought the request would need to be justified with a demonstration of hard facts and substantiated that request. We presented you all with a request that represents the reality of the resources needed, in fact required, to serve our over 107,000 customers across the 60 towns here in the state of Connecticut. We don't feel it was an unreasonable request. And in respect of this authority's need for due diligence and the company's burden, our burden to demonstrate the privacy, our company, and folks largely here, provided you nearly 1,400 interrogatory responses, audit requests, late files, more documentation than we've ever provided in a rate case in our history. Yet the draft decision represents a mere 12% of our request. In transparency and straight talk to you all today, I must let you know that this 12% will cause harm to the way in which we do our business, particularly in light of what lies ahead of the water industry as a whole, including a number of issues we have discussed as part of this docket, such as PFAS treatment, lead and copper service line replacement, cybersecurity, improved systems to serve our customers, the demands of the modern workforce, and our responsibility to be a force for good in the communities we serve. From the perspective of a negative regulatory environment in Connecticut, and in the course of this very proceeding, Connecticut Water was put on a negative outlook by ratings agencies. Aquarion, in fact, recently received a credit rating downgrade, and as recently as a week ago, CWC received signals that a downgrade for CWC is imminent should the final decision not improve from the draft parameters. We were told, quote, "The current environment does not warrant the above average credit supportive regulatory jurisdiction currently bestowed on the Connecticut Water Company," unquote. This is real-time stuff. A lower credit rating will ultimately cost our customers more because of the cost of the necessity of capital as Connecticut Water stands ready and is in fact mandated to respond to PFAS regulation, lead service lines, aging infrastructures, and so on, the challenges that face the industry. I can't believe that that would be the intent of that draft decision, which is why I think we need to go at it hard on merit. Coupled with regulatory lag, the draft decision caps our return at 7.6%, inclusive of the disallowances indicated within that draft decision. The equity layer of 52% and ignores the fact that said regulatory lag will only cause that percentage to go down in subsequent years. I don't want to stand here and intimate that it's all bad. It certainly is not. The draft decision, we have made meaningful social and policy progress, some of which is first in class for a water utility in Connecticut. The water rate adjustment program proposed by the company and approved in this draft will expand eligibility to the company's assistance program and provide meaningful discounts to customers with low incomes, those that need it the most. The TF conservation rate proposed by the company will make meaningful progress towards our shared conservation goals to ensure that those users who are driving the cost of the production, the cost of our facilities, that they are in fact paying their fair share. Recognition of our solar installation program drives energy cost savings for the customers while also making progress towards the state's greenhouse gas reduction goals. We're proud of all of that. We as well have been a willing partner in advancing this authority's efforts toward performance-based rate making and are committed to expanding programs and reporting on the data on customer collections, outreach to environmental justice communities, diversity, equity, and inclusion programs, and any other items that we think are pertinent and that would help to better tell the story of us. And we have demonstrated again through this process that our customers, our employees, and our communities remain highly satisfied with their Connecticut water experience. We have acted as we had committed, in good faith, with the hope to build a level of trust with this authority as a partner to achieve our common goals. But in determining how best to serve our customers, affordability cannot be our singular goal, and politics should not play a role. We collectively do not have the luxury of providing sound bites to gain favor for election cycle fodder. Our collective calling is a much higher one. We have the health and the safety of our public in our very hands. I've said before, many of you have heard me, water is just different. Humans have lived only the last couple of hundred years with the convenience of electricity, gas, and cable. Yet in millions of years of existence, we have not lived a single day without access to water. Water remains a comparative bargain, despite being at the nexus with the ever-increasing energy costs. Should it be? Is a valid question. Since 2016, bottled water has been the top-selling bottled beverage in the United States. Consumers, customers have shown a willingness to pay almost $2 for a pint of water. Our ask in our proceeding here still keeps our costs at just over a penny a gallon. There's something upside down about that. From infrastructure investment to training dedicated employees to building customer and community trust, protecting our environment, and yes, providing a fair return on investment to our shareholder, it's elemental. One need not look as far as Jackson, Mississippi, or Flint, Michigan, or Miami Beach Sound View system in Old Lyme. We have several systems in need here. Those who have prioritized the cost of water over the expense of what it truly takes to produce that water continues to be taken for granted. Connecticut Water has submitted our specific objections to the draft decision via written exception. And to be clear, we're excited about the positive change we can enact with your approval to expand our water rate assistance program and our increased conservation efforts. But my ask to you here today is to lean into the common mission of balance amongst the stakeholders. It's more important today than probably ever, as our customers are dependent upon our abilities to continue to serve them, the people who serve them, their communities, the environment in which they live, and yes, the shareholders who've found that infrastructure that's required. Thank you for your time here today.
Thank you, Chairman Gillette. I did have the benefit of reading Mr. Patla's statement before today, and it caused me to reflect and include some comments that I had not intended to make because he spoke in terms of balance, and I thought I'd offer my perspective for whatever it's worth with respect to that. My own experience is interesting in that I started working at this agency, or at least its predecessor. My first job out of law school was working in the consumer assistance unit and working to save from termination ratepayers and negotiating with utility companies in that respect. After a short time, I went to the Consumer Counsel's office, where I worked with Mr. Sobolewski and one of the best lawyers I ever knew, Jim Meehan, who was our boss, and ultimately went into private practice. So I have a perspective that benefits from all points of view, regulator, consumer advocate, and from private industry. As a consequence, I've been known to say, it's not my job to tell my client what they want to hear. My job is to tell them what they need to hear, and it's influenced by my own experience. That's not a hard job with Connecticut Water. The company philosophy, as articulated by Mr. Patla, has always been apparent to me. And in large measure, at least in recent years, that stems from the top with its prior CEO and the current CEO of its parent, San Jose Water, Mr. Thornburg. Mr. Thornburg always stressed the need to balance shareholder interest with ratepayer interest. That is the primary function of a public service company. It was not surprising at all to me when Mr. Thornburg left. One of his first items of action was to acquire Connecticut Water. Why? He knew the team. He helped to put it together. And that culture and the philosophy has continued, first with Mr. Benoit, then Ms. Westbrook, and today with Mr. Patla. Company's philosophy is a fair balancing of ratepayer and shareholder interest is paramount. That is why the company has had such a strong reaction to the proposed decision. It's also why, when approached by Mr. Patla's predecessor, Ms. Westbrook, in response to her question as to whether I would be willing to represent the company, my response was I would be proud to represent Connecticut Water. I had known Mr. Thornburg, Ms. Westbrook, Mr. Benoit, Ms. Johnson, and Mr. Patla and Mr. Dixon for many years. I knew they shared the right vision and philosophy with respect to the regulatory process. Why do I focus on these non-numerical comments? Because the proposed decision seems to say something otherwise. It predicates some of its conclusions on what I rightly or wrongly, and what the company rightfully or wrongly perceive as an ill-founded belief that the company's primary focus is on shareholder interest. As Mr. Patla said, that is far from the case. That's simply not the Connecticut Water way. I won't speak to many of the specific issues that are referenced in our written exceptions. I'm mindful of the request that parties not reiterate what's in their written exception. So I'll just highlight a couple of things if I could. First, with respect to the cost of capital, there are three areas where we believe there are errors in the proposed decision. The first is with respect to the growth rate that was used in the DCF calculation. The authority seems to agree with both the OCC and the company that it's appropriate to use a proxy group comprised of both natural gas and water utilities. The EOE did not share that view. Its proxy group was limited to water companies. Yet when calculating the range of the estimated growth rate, the proposed decision appears to use the lower rates presented by EOE. That is simply inappropriate because we're not using their proxy group. If you correct that error, that results in a DCF result that is higher than reflected in the proposed decision. The second one is with regard to the risk-free rate. For many years, the authority has stated its preference for actual interest rates rather than projections. We may disagree with that, but in this proceeding, Ms. Bulkley did use the historic rates. The proposed decision seems to mistakenly characterize what was used as interest rates that were a projection. In fact, the company used the 30-day historical average yield on the 30-year bond. By stating these backwards, it results in an incorrect range for the yield on the 30-year Treasury bond. Using the correct rate would increase the basis for the CAPM, and the ultimate result is that you end up with an ROE range that is more in line with 9.3 to 10.97, rather than what's reflected in the proposed decision. So we'd ask that the authority go back and take a look at that and make the appropriate correction. Finally, with respect to capital structure, the company's written exception stressed the importance of using a capital structure as it relates to market outlooks. The proposed decision incorrectly states that the capital structure it incorrectly states what the capital structure is for the company to maintain its credit rating. While the company believes that market capitalization should be viewed at the operating company level, if you look at the capital structures of those companies that were used in the proxy group, you get a range that goes from as high as 65.9 and 65.42, both well above the 53% that the company is requesting here. Accordingly, the company would ask that the final decision reflect acceptance of the company's actual capital structure of 53%. Rate base. The proposed decision basically ensures that the company will not earn its rate of return. If the revenue requirement is intended to be aligned with actual costs during the same period, then utility plant and service, just like any other component, must be extended to the midpoint of the rate year. This is the matching principle in accounting and its basic fairness. The proposed decision contemplates only allowing recovery of projects completed as of February 9, 2024, which was the close of the evidentiary record. Yet, at the same time, it includes an adjustment to approximate accumulated depreciation at the start of the rate year, July 1, 2024. Left unaddressed, this is one of those items that, as Mr. Patler referred to, as punitive. As it currently stands, the company would be required to reflect in rates the effect of depreciation for the time period during which plant additions were disallowed. If you look at reality, plant is always going to grow in the water industry. As rate base grows, if plant were to go down, which it never does, you would have an inverse effect. But I can't recall that ever happened. The effect of the proposed decision is to shrink rate base from the actual levels at the end of 2023. What the company has requested, ideally, is that you demonstrate, you'd use the same date both for rate base as you do for accumulated depreciation. We would love it if it were December 31, 2024, if we're using the midpoint of the rate year. But at minimum, it should be it should really be no later than July 1, 2024.
Attorney Bogan, to effectuate that, are you suggesting that we take 1/12 of my recollection from the written exceptions is that you take issue to us having the depreciation rates for the year to get the accumulated depreciation as of July 1st. So are you suggesting that we take 1/12 of the depreciation for that year to get to the match of February 9th? Just, can you help me understand that a little bit, what the company is suggesting?
Yeah, that would be correct.
Okay, thank you.
Earnings sharing mechanism. This is another one where the company believes it's patently unfair. Effectively, what the proposed decision says is that the company should reflect in its calculation of the earnings sharing mechanism those costs that were disallowed. Well, what that means is that it's never going to earn its return, and it's always going to be in an over earnings position. If you disallow those costs, that doesn't mean the company is going to stop incurring the costs. They should appropriately be excluded from the calculation, because otherwise you're going to say, well, you've got to exclude, include it, because if you exclude them, well, all things being equal, it will over earn, because you're assuming that it doesn't incur costs that in fact it is going to incur. The company should be authorized to include all of its costs in the ESM calculation. We understand that for rate purposes, you're not allowing it, but for going forward purposes in calculating the earnings sharing mechanism, the company should be allowed to include that. Otherwise, it's a false reality. They're being asked to calculate it, knowing those costs are being incurred, but they're being included, and so therefore it looks like they're over earning, and they are not. That would be consistent with, we don't agree with the exclusion, but at least that's a balancing of ratepayer and shareholder interests going forward. IT expense. We think this was simply a misunderstanding of what the company had portrayed as its IT expense. The proposed decision seems to assume that the entire pro forma IT expense is included in the residual O&M expense. It is not. The proposed decision only contemplates, it's part of total target compensation. That is $727,707 of that amount is reflected in total target compensation. It's not in residual O&M.
Can you say that? So if the authority incorrectly thought that that was included in residual O&M to allow the adjustment in the rate year, would have been a double recovery of those salaries, but the company's position is that it was not reflected in residual?
No, I don't think I wouldn't characterize it as a double recovery. The amount, the $720,707 is included in total target compensation as part of salaries. So it's handled over there. The residual, what's left is in the residual O&M. So it's not a double recovery. What's happening is what the proposed decision does is to say, oh, well, that's in residual O&M. We don't think that the company has supported its position, so we're going to reduce that amount by, I forgot what it is, it might be $1 million something. Well, wait a minute. If it's included as part of total target compensation, that means you've already addressed it by way of the salaries. And we know that the proposed decision only contemplates removal of one employee. So it's a disconnect if you try to then say, okay, we're only going to reduce salaries by one employee, but then you're going to reduce the amount, the number, which is mistakenly characterized as residual O&M by $720,000.
Okay, I think I understand. So let me say this back to you. If we had thought that the salaries associated with those IT employees were not proven, the FTE count should have been reduced. And alternatively, if we thought that those positions had been sustained, then the 720,000 should have been reflected as a rate year adjustment.
I think that's probably an accurate statement. And what I'm saying is I think you've got it. And what I'm saying is you can't do both. You can't include, you can't say the salaries are okay, these employees are okay, but then a portion of those salaries we're going to disallow because you didn't disallow the employees. You're only able to make that leap of faith because it mistakenly characterized this number, a portion of the total number, as residual O&M.
Okay, and so the 720.
707.
707. This is a subset of what the authorities draft characterized as an unexplained $1 million increase plus the pro forma adjustment.
Well, I would agree with you up until where you said unexplained, because I would say we explained it by virtue of the total target compensation at the employee level.
Understood. I think I'm asking, I will concede that that is the draft's language and not yours. What I'm trying to figure out is the draft's language says that the authority disallows the unexplained 1 million, it's a little over $1 million increase and 215,000 pro forma inflation adjustment. So I'm asking this to clarify that the 720,000 is a subset of that $1 million.
That is correct.
Okay,
Yeah, that is correct. Which goes to the second piece, unless
Please.
you want to stick here.
no, I think I'm following you. So the second piece, though, like roughly 300,000, that gets us up to that million. I understand the pro forma.
Yeah, I don't recall what the residual amount there is. That, even if you accept my argument, the authority's position would be, well, okay, there's still this other piece that should be disallowed. We would say that's inappropriate. That amount goes to cybersecurity expenses. And we know that in this society in which we live today, cybersecurity investments are critical. The proposed decision suggests the company did not substantiate its position on that. We would respectfully disagree. We answered any number of interrogatories that relate to the issue of the expense. But at minimum, it should be the 720. We believe the entire amount should be there because either it's salaries or it's residual expense associated with cybersecurity.
Okay, so the residual expense associated with cybersecurity, whatever that residual number is, 320,000 or something. I think where I'm struggling is I don't recall being able to match that amount to any substantiation in the record. Do you recall, like, is your position that it was an amalgamation of evidence or anything specific that you would want me to look at for that 320,000?
That's a fair question. May I have a moment?
Please.
Thank you, Chairman Gillette. I'm advised that although the company did provide person-by-person salary information with respect to the IT expense, you are correct that the residual expense associated with cybersecurity was more of an conglomeration of other information. That you can't point to any single interrogatory or testimony with respect to cybersecurity. I would concede that.
I would appreciate that. While we're on this, just back up to the $720,707. If I understand that correctly now to be the amount directly attributable to salaries, the company's application proposed an inflation adjustment to that amount. Does the company concede that employees' salaries or raises are a known and measurable adjustment, or does the company have, I'm struggling with the application of an inflation factor to salaries.
I understand your point entirely. So basically what you're saying. Thank you again. I understand your confusion. I'm told that the data request that was provided apply the 6.15 inflation adjustment to the entire amount. The salary number, though, that was in the application is the actual number, and that did not include the 6.15%.
The 720,707 is the uninflated
That is correct.
number.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. I don't have any other questions on the IT expense. I think I understand the company's position. I didn't mean to interrupt though if you're.
Oh, not at all. I want to make sure that you're clear on what the company's position is on these issues.
I got that one.
Only a couple of other things I want to touch upon. Tank painting, the approach that the proposed decision appears to take, if we're correct in our interpretation, deviates from the historical method used by the authority for, which allows for deferral and subsequent amortization of those costs. I would note that unless I'm mistaken, OCC seems to share that concern. The company generally prefers to keep things unchanged and likes the OCC's exceptions in this regard. But if the authority wants to maintain the position set forth in the proposed decision, we would propose that in lieu of the method that you suggest, we would create a balancing account. The problem is that tank painting and maintenance can vary from year to year based upon tank size, tank condition, the type of tank. So what the company proposes to establish a balancing account, and each year it would charge an amount. I think we proposed $395,377. That's the amount that's currently provided for recovery through rates. Against that, we would net the actual expense to offset the future expenses. So then what we would do is we would look at it at the end of the year, decide is there credit or is there too much that was earned, and we would use it if there's money that's owed to ratepayers, that would be credited on an ongoing basis. On the contrary, if it's the other way around, that would be reserved and used to apply in future years.
Thank you. Can I ask a clarifying question? I like the idea. I can't tell from the company's written exceptions on page 23 what the two-part question. I can't tell what the order is that you need from the authority. Is this a traditional deferred accounting concept? So you just need reasonable certainty that this would be recoverable at the next break? Like, I'm just not familiar with the use of the term balancing. So I'm asking if there's a specific order that you need from the authority.
I don't know if this is helpful or not, but I'm told that the language that we just need something in the decision that says you can create this balancing account. Doesn't have to
Okay.
be a specific number, but just something that authorizes this sort of methodology.
Thank you. And along with that methodology, I also didn't see anything in the written exceptions that addressed carrying charges. Is the company requesting, what is the company's request with respect to carrying charges in either direction that would apply to the account?
So is there a, yeah.
So you charge, maybe this is a good exercise to make sure I understand the concept. I was taking it, we authorized 395,377 in rates as an expense. So at the start of the year, you put that into an account. You only spent 200,000 that year, 195,377. Does accrue carrying
Understood.
charges at whack
Yeah.
or the reverse?
So is your question that 195 that represents the delta that's put into this account, is there any sort of return that's applied to that?
Correct. And also in the opposite, I know
Understood.
it's picked one way.
Understood. I think we were looking for that. Mr. Dixon's conversing with the financial
Sure.
heads. Yeah, I think hopefully this is a satisfactory answer to you. Whatever you want, as long as whatever is decided with respect to how those carrying charges are handled in either direction is applied in both directions. That's all. So if there's a surplus, there's a return that's applied. If there's a delta, that is the company in your hypothesis didn't spend the 195, that the same component would be applied to that delta.
I appreciate that. So symmetrical treatment. So if the authority were to embrace the company's proposal to create a balancing account here. So if we have three options on the table, historical treatment, what the draft proposed, or the third option of the balancing account, would you hazard to place those three on a spectrum in terms of the where the risk lies? I can tell you where I think the risk lies in each of those three, but I'm not sure that's as helpful as the company conceding or addressing whether the balancing account is more or less risky to ratepayers than what the draft proposes, more or less risky than historical treatment.
Thank you, Chairman Gillette. See if I've got this straight. The balancing account, if there's no carrying charges, probably has the middle risk. If you had the current scenario, there's probably more risk to the company because there's the opportunity for regulatory lag no matter what. There was a third option, I
The
think.
third option is historical treatment, which I would characterize as having, I would have put them on a spectrum just as you did, except I would put historical treatment as more tilted to the in favor of the company
I don't think so.
in terms of risk,
I don't think so.
with the balancing account in the
Regulatory lag.
middle.
Yeah. Yeah, I can see your point. The problem is under that method, you incur the expense today, start amortizing, but you don't recover till later. So it's more risky to the company, that's for sure.
Okay. All right, in the balancing account proposal, is there a prudency analysis that comes at the next rate case? I saw the company's proposal that the balance of the balancing account could be used to set up the same balancing account at the next rate case, but I was unclear as to whether that was still maintaining a prudency analysis of everything that had been spent since.
Yeah, I think the proposed treatment or adopted treatment would not ameliorate the need to undergo a prudency review, just as you would for any expense.
Okay, thank you. I am fully understanding the balancing account.
Thank you. Just a few more. Power expense, this is one where I think it's pretty simple. We simply think that the proposed decision misinterpreted the data that was presented. We believe that it used, and I think it says 13 months of expense, when in fact it was 12 that was used.
I understood the point.
Yeah. And I would also note that there were no questions, to the best of our recollection, that were asked during the proceeding about this expense. So,
Okay, thank you.
chemical expense, the proposed decision finds the company's position on the expense to be excessive and unsupported. However, it seems to ignore several interrogatory responses that support the expense. They are referenced in our written exceptions, OCC 360, OCC 155, Exhibit 1, and OCC 359, Exhibit 1. And I would note that the company's approach to chemical expense is pretty simple. You take historical volumes and you multiply it by the prevailing market price. The price that's reflected in the calculation in the application was the result of the company's annual bidding process. And so therefore, the company submits that no adjustment is warranted here, and the allowed expense of $207,550 should be reinstated.
Thank you. Give me 1 second.
The revenue adjustment mechanism, as we understand it, that is how the company would have the opportunity to earn the additional revenues set forth in the decision. I think we again agree with OCC here. We don't necessarily disagree or object to what's proposed. We just think we need to have certainty as to what the expectation is, as to what the company is going to be required to provide at that time. I read the OCC comments to share that concern, although maybe for slightly different reasons. So we simply ask that the final decision include an order that we said would recommend that we have a technical meeting before the company submits that first compliance filing, so that we're on the same page with what the authority is expecting there.
Thank you. While we're on that filing, I think I read a request to move that filing from February 1st to February 28th. I recalled, I thought that the RAM filing had historically been due by February 1st, but what I read the written exceptions to say is that that was incorrect and it was February 28th.
It is February. I'm advised that we actually make the filing on February 28th.
Okay, and so is the RAM year historically then March 1st to February 28th, or is it April 1st to March 3rd?
April 1, 30. April 1 to March 31.
Okay, all right, thank you. So on the RAM piece, and I can ask OCC this too, but I guess I had read their written exceptions to have a different critique of the use of RAM than what you just articulated. Is the company taking a position on the authority's authority to use the RAM in this way?
I think, 1 second. I don't know if you'll find this response unsatisfying, but I think when I said the OCC seems to share the concerns, and you're drilling down a little bit further, which is to say, well, the OCC seems to suggest that the RAM is not appropriate from a legal perspective to include these sorts of numbers. I don't know that we take a position on that. We hadn't looked at that from the statutory perspective. Our concern is simply that, and maybe this is a variation of what OCC is suggesting, there are a lot of things that are being thrown in the RAM. Historically, that's not been the case. So I think OCC says, yeah, it's not been the case because it's not legally appropriate to include these costs in the RAM. We're not going to die on that hill.
Okay. Okay, I think that gets me what I need. I appreciate that. I have questions on other topics that you haven't yet covered, but.
All right, well, then
you
what?
still have list.
No, I'm actually ready to wind up. So if you want to fire away, go ahead.
Thank you. On page 19 of the written exceptions, the company requests that we clarify the future recoverability of disallowances, and you provided some language. I guess I have a question in the inverse, which is what in the draft decision implies that you can't do this?
It's simply deferred expense. We can't recover deferred expense unless we're allowed. Said we can defer. Slightly different response than I was going to get. I think the concern is absent the language that we're requesting here. It is possible that because the expense or the addition is not considered used and useful at this point, that an auditor can then look at it and say, well, if that was disallowed, you have to write that off. So that's why we're simply saying, can we at least have language in the decision that authorizes us to defer it in case that happens?
Okay, thank you. On the RAP program, I'm sorry, one more thing on that. So when I read your suggested language, my concern was that like this language might actually harm the company and precluding it from seeking projects in the future that were not identified in the rate case, which is why I started my question how I did, which is it more appropriate to strike something from the decision that gave you the impression that you couldn't do this? Because I have a concern over whether this language might actually harm the company. So with that clarification, does your answer change?
I think your concern was the one that I was going to respond with. I apologize for the.
I'd rather get the right answer.
I mean,
I'm happy.
these go to detailed financial questions. I'm told that perhaps the better way to think about it, and maybe this would address your concern, is that the expense with the language that we're asking, and maybe you want a variation on the language, it would be akin to construction work in process, which is something that we incur the expense now, but we have the ability to come in and recover later. But if you think the language as proposed might actually hurt the company, I'm certainly not going to object to your clarification to address your concern.
Okay. All right, thank you. Sorry, now I'd like to move to the wrap. I appreciated the flag from the company on page 39 about the investment of time and resources to configure the billing system for a revenue cap. I guess my question is, let me scroll back to my question here. Was there something that was there a way to accomplish the same objective if there was a quarterly
Billing?
quarterly limit? So the tier 2 threshold, if we employed a quarterly limit that matched the tier 2 threshold, would it be an easier change in in the company's billing process?
Yeah, no. The answer is pretty straightforward and hopefully satisfying. And that is that it doesn't matter whether whether the company does quarterly review or monthly review. We don't have the technological ability to do it. And so therefore it would have to be a manual process. And
Okay, thank you. I appreciate the company's constructive suggestion, which I appreciate the company providing a constructive suggestion. I'm not sure it is the direction that I would take it if it were up to me, but does the company have any thoughts on like the type of reporting that might be ordered in lieu of a revenue cap so that everyone was collectively in a position to evaluate if a usage cap outweighed the cost of implementing one at the next rate case?
you have an idea? The proposed decision already requires that the company provide a report with respect to RAP enrollment. We can include usage information as part of that report, if that's helpful.
Thank you. Okay. Winding down with my questions here, I think. On page 41, have the bullet about utility plant rental income. I appreciated the explanation about the difference between late payment charges and utility plant. What I was not clear about from the written exceptions were what the company's request was with respect to that specific bullet. Like you say, if the intent is this, like, are you asking us to clarify that that is the intent or are you just telling us that this is how you're gonna do it? I just wasn't totally clear what the request was.
Hopefully this is clear. It's really a question of making sure we're on the same page. What's reflected in the written exceptions reflects our interpretation of what we believe the proposed decision is saying. We just want to make sure we're on the same page.
Thank you. I'm sorry, I think I skipped a question on the Willis Tower Watson issue. The written exceptions had some detail that I was not previously familiar with, but I noticed that there was not any citations to the record evidence on where you pulled some of the specific examples of their expertise and level of service. And I'm hoping you can point me to a specific interrogatory where I could find the information.
I cannot.
Okay, thank you. I think we covered everything. Was there something that I didn't ask a question about that I cut you off in your presentation?
No, that's quite all right. I appreciate the questions. I have nothing further. I'll just go back to where Mr. Patla started and that I kind of picked up on. We've tried to be open and transparent throughout the process, and we believe we've done that. At the same time, we're also doing everything that we can to maintain our credit rating. Left unchanged, as Mr. Patla said, that will make it very difficult. Lower credit rating means higher cost of debt. Higher cost of debt means that ultimately result in higher costs passed on to ratepayers. The company believes its application reflects prudent utility management, and we'd ask that at minimum, the final decision be amended to reflect the changes requested in our written exceptions.
Thank you. And to be clear, the monetary value associated with the changes detailed in your written exceptions can be found on page 8 and roughly $5.42.
That is correct, Chairman Gillette.
Okay. Thank you. Okay, I'm gonna leave it there.
Thank you.
Thank you. Attorney Minikowski, please.
Good afternoon, Chairman Gillette. Andrew Minikowski on behalf of the Office of Consumer Counsel. To start with, the authorities in receipt of our written exceptions, we rest upon those. However, I would like to briefly respond to several of the points that Attorney Bogan has made today on behalf of the company. We heard this afternoon that the company is, and I quote, disillusioned with the process, disillusioned with the decision that it has received. That is not the experience of the Office of Consumer Counsel and the ratepayers that we represent. I wouldn't say that we are heartened by it, that we are enlightened by it. The draft decision is an exemplar of what utility regulation should look like in this state and in this country. It effectively balances the needs of the company's ratepayers with the needs of the company. and arrives at a just and reasonable result that all parties should be able to coalesce around. In that regard, the OCC strongly supports the draft decision as drafted. However, I will touch on several points that are of note to our office. First, the cost of capital. We heard the argument by the company this afternoon regarding the cost of capital that the draft decision proposes. However, the OCC would submit that the draft decision's conclusion is supported by the evidence in the record. Now, there were 3 different very qualified experts that testified to this particular matter in the course of the hearings in 3 different sets of evidence in regard. However, the authority has the ability legally to weigh that evidence and come to a reasoned conclusion, which it has done in this case. First, General Statutes 4-178. The authority has the technical expertise through its staff and its commissioners to weigh that highly technical financial data that's used to arrive at the appropriate ROE for the company. And it's done so in this case. The company's written exceptions, we've reviewed them, and we understand that they may have preferred a different outcome, but the outcome that the authority has arrived at nonetheless is legally supportable by the data and also consistent with what the OCC's witness has proposed in this matter. Second, there's case law that backs up the authority in this matter. When there's evidence put forth in administrative proceeding, the rules of evidence don't apply. However, the hearing officer or the commissioners of an agency have the ability to consider all of the evidence, none of the evidence, or part of the evidence. And that's at the discretion of the commission. And the commission has done that in this case and arrived at a just, reasonable, and legally supportable decision in regard to the cost of capital. And the OCC would strongly support that. Although the decision does not fully align with what the OCC had recommended, it is nonetheless in the acceptable range of what we had proposed in this proceeding. And I would argue that the draft decision not be amended in that regard. Moving on to rate base, Attorney Bogan had raised this issue of 2 different dates in regard to depreciation, February versus July. There was some discussion around that. The OCC does agree that the closing date should be consistent between the plant allowed in rate base and the accumulated depreciation. Those should probably be aligned in the decision just for consistency's sake. Likewise, in terms of future recovery, once plant goes into service, if the company would like to come in a future case and argue for recovery of those expenses that are not currently in service, the OCC believes they should be free to do so, and my office and the authority and other parties would be able to review those expenses at that time and determine whether we think they are appropriate or not. Next, moving on to O&M, there are several issues here, most of which are not terribly contentious from our perspective. We've talked about the purchase power expenses, the chemical expenses this afternoon that the company has incurred. In our brief, the OCC did not recommend any adjustments compared with what the company had initially filed in this regard. So to the extent that the authority makes any additions or changes in the draft decision compared to those expenses, the OCC would not oppose that. And to the extent the authority wishes to reconsider those, we would have no objections. In regard to tank painting, which we've talked about this afternoon, the proposal that the company has put forth in its written exceptions, we don't necessarily have any concerns with that. In our own written exceptions, we did raise that, tank painting was a concern, or the expense, not tank painting itself, the expenses related to it were a concern of the OCC. The proposal that the company has made in its exceptions, we believe, is reasonable to the extent that the authority takes that under consideration. Again, we would not oppose that. I would like to raise one issue that my colleague, Attorney Bogan, did not raise in his argument, but is in the written exceptions of the company. And this would regard what I'll call the public act disallowances. These were a series of 3 expenses: membership dues, board of directors expenses, and investor relations expenses that were disallowed in the draft decision. The OCC strongly supports that part of the draft decision. The company has raised an argument that this would violate General Statutes 55-3, which enshrines the mandate that no legislation shall be applied retroactively where it places a burden on a company or a person or an individual. That's not the case here. you know, when we're looking at a rate case, we're looking at the test year expenses. The actual rate plan that goes into effect from the decision is forward-looking. Rates are forward-looking. That's just the reality of rate making. And so if the authority uses the Public Act to disallow those expenses, there's no retroactivity question whatsoever, in our opinion, because this rate plan is going forward. The actual rate year that ratepayers will be paying into is out in the future. And this Public Act is the law of the state at this point, and we believe the authority was fully justified in exercising its authority under that law to disallow those three categories of expenses. I would like to respond at one point. There's a section of the company's written exceptions that was titled Increased Cost to Ratepayers. And as you may imagine, I immediately turned to that section of the written exceptions only to be sorely disappointed because it didn't actually involve increased costs to ratepayers. It was just the same sad, sorry argument we've heard from multiple companies at this point about credit ratings. And that's not to diminish the fact that credit ratings do have an impact on these companies' day-to-day operations. However, what's the legal standard? The legal standard is that the companies are entitled to revenue that is, quote, no more than sufficient, end quote. That's what they're entitled to. Now, we understand that investors, Wall Street, those folks may wish that the companies could make unlimited amounts of money, huge amounts of money. But the reality is utility companies aren't like normal companies. They have natural monopolies. They serve the public and serve a public function and are rate regulated as a result. And that's just the reality of the world we live in under our legal system at this time. The companies might not like that. Their investors might not like it, but that's the law. And so if a company has a credit down rating, that's but one part of what investors will look at when the company goes out to attract capital. Does it look good from a company perspective? I imagine it doesn't. But that's only one thing. And if the company wants to increase investor relations and investor confidence, they can do so in other ways. And to say that the ratepayers will bear the burden of that, I think is unfair and slightly inaccurate. To move on, there are two matters that we've discussed this afternoon with the prospect of a future technical meeting to potentially hash out some details. The OCC would support both of those. One was the RAP. We talked about administrative costs and how to implement the RAP. If there was a technical meeting there, the OCC would like to participate and explore those issues further. We didn't discuss this, but it is one where the OCC would like to raise it. Performance metrics. We're glad to see that the company had agreed to abide by the performance metrics that are in the draft decision. But we do agree with the company on this point that it would be a good idea to have a technical meeting to make sure we're all on the same page. Everyone knows what's going to happen. What does compliance look like? And again, the OCC would like to participate in that. Concluding points. The Willis Towers Watson, is that right? It sounds like a Victorian novel villain. Again, we would agree there's no evidence in the record to back up those costs. And we have reviewed the draft decision in that regard. I believe the company has conceded that point in its argument this afternoon, but the OCC would just like to point out we are not familiar with any evidence in the record that would back up those additional points made in the company's written exceptions in an attempt to justify those costs. The ESM, and this is probably my final point. The company has raised the point that the disallowed costs should not be included in the ESM for calculation purposes. The OCC actually would agree with that. We just believe it's consistent with what has been done across other companies and would rest on that point. If the chair has no questions for me, I would like to briefly turn the lectern to my colleague. But if you do have questions, I'll answer them before I do that.
I do have a quick question, please. On the RAP piece, it was not my recollection that the OCC had a position on whether there should be a usage cap at the time of your briefs. And I'm wondering if the Consumer Counsel's office has a position on, or a response to the company's position and written exceptions on the usage cap.
The usage cap. We have a position. We would just request reporting from the company on it and then revisit it as that comes in and determine the appropriate level that it should be going forward, you know, based on actual use experience of customers.
I'm sorry, you said reporting?
Yeah, or
Okay, okay.
compliance filing, however the authority sees fit to effectuate that.
Okay. Thank you. I think you can turn it to your colleague.
All right, now I'll turn to Attorney McCorney now, who's going to speak briefly on the issue of PFAS.
Good afternoon, Chair Gillette, Allison McCorney for the Office of Consumer Counsel. As my colleague Attorney Minikowski just said, I'd like to briefly touch on some points made in our written exceptions. There was much discussion about PFAS during the evidentiary hearings, both about chemicals already present in the Connecticut water system and about the proposed EPA rule regarding PFAS in drinking water. Those regulations have now been finalized, and while the OCC applauds this new rule and its scope of providing clean and safe drinking water, we also recognize that in order for water companies to meet this new standard, it's going to require a very large amount of capital investment outside of what is planned for in the normal course of business. The size of the investment needed and the complexity of the treatment required necessitates, in our view, a review process outside of rate cases. During the evidentiary hearings, a company witness indicated the company is preparing a PFAS master plan to better understand not only the potential contaminant levels at any site, but the ways in which current treatment facilities may interact with necessary PFAS treatment. The authority, OCC, and other stakeholders should have the opportunity to evaluate that plan, but cannot adequately do so in the context of a rate case unless we expect every water company to come in annually until they are in full compliance with the new EPA regulation. I therefore would urge the authority to reconsider OCC's suggestion of convening a separate docket for the review and recovery of all PFAS-related expenses, not just for Connecticut Water, but all regulated water companies in the state. And I'm happy to answer any questions, Chair Gillette, if you have any.
Thank you, Attorney McCorney. Is there anything that prevents the authority from opening such a docket, even if we don't mention so here?
Certainly not, and we would applaud a decision to do so. It's only that this is the first time where PFAS has really come up in a proceeding before the authority, so we had taken the opportunity to state our views on what we would consider a prudent way to review these costs moving forward.
Thank you. And if we were to open such a docket, would it apply to just this company?
No, it would be a generic docket for all regulated water companies in the state.
Thank you.
Thank you. You're good? Okay. And I think that's it for OCC. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Attorney Wright.
Thank you, Chairman Gillette. We took no exceptions in this matter, and I'll accordingly be very brief. We want to thank the authority and its staff for the careful and attentive work that was evidenced by the proposed final decision. I'd also like to echo the comments of Attorneys Minikowski and McCorney from the OCC, and we would agree with all of those comments presented just now. I think it's important to note that this is an outstanding company, Connecticut Water. There's no question about that. And Connecticut Water wasn't shy about stating that they are an outstanding company, and we don't disagree in the least. It's evidenced by their corporate character, quality of their management, quality of their witnesses in this proceeding from top to bottom. Also, that we never see any complaints from consumers from Connecticut Water. In fact, I used to go to their president when we did have a question because we never had a contact for any of those folks. They're disappointed with this decision. We support the decision entirely. I think also evidence of the quality of this company is the tone and tenor of the written exceptions that were presented. And in particular, a lot of the tone and tenor that was not presented, things that were not said. And I appreciate that. And the respectful tone of the oral argument here today. That said, this was not a punitive decision. It was based on a reasoned analysis, and in some respects was quite favorable to the company. And in particular, I'd like to bring up the return on equity component. That was a reasonable and balanced decision that you made. And it was respectively 40 and 50 basis points higher than the last two rate decisions that you made. And Connecticut Water is a relatively low-risk company, but that's an appropriate return on that. We would urge you to make that in the final decision without modification. Obviously, you should carefully consider the company's exceptions. They were detailed. And from your back and forth colloquy with counsel for the company and its management, it's clear you are taking them seriously. You've considered them, you've thought about them, and you were prepared to deal with them in oral argument today. And the Attorney General is absolutely confident you'll come to an appropriate resolution to all those issues and that will support those resolutions. I have nothing else I wanted to say. If you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer them.
I don't think I do. Thank you very much for being here.
Thank you.
Attorney Nigro.
Good afternoon.
Good
For the
afternoon.
record, I'm Susanna Nigro, and I'm here on behalf of the Department of Energy and Environmental Protection. We would like to first thank the authority for your work and careful consideration in creating the detailed and thorough proposed final decision in this docket, and for the opportunity to appear before you today for oral argument on our written exceptions. In the written exceptions, DEEP has highlighted 4 main areas. 3 of those areas were submitted in further agreement and support of the authority's proposed final decision, specifically on the issues of tiered volumetric usage rates, non-revenue water, and acoustic leak detection monitors. DEEP expresses its agreement with and support of the proposed final decision and the reasoning contained therein, and we will otherwise rest on our brief with respect to those issues. The remaining exception concerns the portion of the proposed final decision related to 4 streamflow gauges that are currently being funded by Connecticut Water shareholders. The authority's discussion of this issue can be found in the proposed final decision on page 164. With respect to the streamflow gauges, DEEP respectfully requests that the authority reconsider 3 aspects of the proposed final decision, which I will first list and then discuss briefly each in turn. First, DEEP respectfully requests that the authority revisit and reconsider the issue of continued funding for the streamflow gauges. Second, DEEP respectfully requests that the authority reconsider or remove the language of the proposed final decision concerning the proximity of the gauges to the company's water sources. Third, DEEP respectfully requests that the authority remove from its decision the language about the water company not being the sole user of water supplies in proximity to the gauge stations. To refresh your recollection, by way of background, at issue are 4 Department of Environmental Energy and Environmental Protection, United States Geological Survey streamflow gauges that are currently active, in use, and broadcasting data. These streamflow gauges are the Mount Hope, Indian River, Naugatuck River, and Broad Brook gauges. These streamflow gauges provide important operational benefits as they collect publicly accessible data regarding impacts on streamflow requirements and health. The streamflow gauges also function to help forecast available water supply and assist in decision-making during drought conditions. They are important tools for the management of the state's natural resources. As noted in the proposed final decision, Connecticut Water first became involved in the funding for these streamflow gauges as part of the merger that occurred as one of the commitments that they engaged in. The decision relating to the merger required Connecticut Water to use shareholder funds to pay for the streamflow gauges for 8 years, beginning in July of 2020, and this commitment will expire in 2028. The department is concerned that this commitment will expire before the next rate hearing. To create a path to ensure that these important tools remain funded, DEEP has requested that the authority find that additional funding can be collected by Connecticut Water as operating costs as part of a RAM proceeding, until such time as the cost can be incorporated into base rates through a rate proceeding. So the continued funding of the gauges is the first issue that we respectfully request that the authority reconsider. The second aspect of the decision, which DEEP respectfully requests be modified or removed from the proposed final decision, is the language that the gauges are not in immediate proximity to the company's water sources. This request is made on the grounds that this language does not acknowledge that there's a relevant nexus between the water supply and the gauges. And I'd like to direct the authority's attention to testimony that Mr. Patla had given as part of a public hearing in January of this year. I think it's page 81 of the transcript. That's further cited in our brief. Mr. Patla links each of the gauges to a water supply of Connecticut Water and describes how Connecticut Water uses these gauges. Therefore, we respectfully request that the authority either amend the decision to recognize that there's a relevant nexus between the water supply and the streamflow gauges, or otherwise remove from the decision the current language about proximity. This leads into the third aspect of the proposed final decision that we're requesting that the authority revisit and remove certain language from. In the end of the decision, as a basis for denying the funding, the authority noted that Connecticut Water is not the sole user of the water supply in proximity to the streamflow gauges. DEEP is concerned that it could be inferred from this language that the water company should only be monitoring its own impact upon natural resources over which it has exclusive use and control. Water resources are interconnected across large areas, and those who affect the supply, particularly larger users of the supply, should have an obligation to monitor the natural resources from which they draw and how their use may impact the state's waterways and habitats surrounding those waterways. This more general approach would be the most consistent with the authority's statutory obligation to consider water conservation and under prudent management of the natural environment pursuant to Connecticut General Statutes 1619E A3. Therefore, DEEP respectfully requests that this language in the proposed final decision be removed. The language we just discussed concerning proximity and exclusivity formed the basis of the authority's decision with respect to funding, which returns us to our first issue. Ultimately, the streamflow gauges are important tools which are needed to preserve the health and well-being of our natural resources, and DEEP respectfully urges the authority to allow Connecticut Water to continue to fund these gauges by collecting and funding as operating costs through a RAM proceeding until a rate hearing can be held. Thank you for your time and consideration.
Thank you, Attorney Negro. So if it's the department's position that we collect or otherwise address funding through the RAM, does that mean that the department disagrees with the Consumer Counsel's legal perspective or legal concern about the use of RAM for other items? Is that question clear?
May I consult, please?
Of course.
Thank you. We would respectfully support any mechanism that would allow the continued funding to occur when the commitment expires.
Okay, so is another way to say that the department, I don't want to use the word concede because I don't think, I just can't think of a better word right now. Does the department concede that the authority has the ability to create any such mechanism in the confines of a rate case?
Yes, the concern I think is that we don't know when the next rate case is going to occur in connection with when the commitment is going to expire. So we're looking for a path that the water company can use to continue the funding for the stream gauges until the next rate hearing occurs.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Attorney Richter?
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Dichter.
Dichter is correct.
I'm sorry. I can't read my own handwriting.
Not a problem. No offense taken. The residents of Heritage Village would like to thank the authority, your madam, and the staff for their hard work they put in representing all the customers of Connecticut Water Company, including Heritage Village, which is, as you know, a 55+ community of some 2,400 homes where although it's 55+, the average age is over 70. So the concerns over rates and utility services is a paramount ongoing monthly or quarterly expense incurred by them that is important to their being able to meet their financial needs in their later years. That would include me, by the way. Now, while rates are important, more important than even that is the quality of water and an adequate supply of water. So in my comments today, we're just going to focus on that part of our exceptions in the regard. As we tried to elicit during these proceedings, Heritage Village's water comes from wells from the old Heritage Village Water Company. One of those wells, wells 2A, has had a problem with manganese going back many years. Manganese not only affects the water, the taste and odor from the water, but there are health concerns raised from it as well. In addition, it came out during cross-examination here that that same well is infected with PFAS. So there are that the current manganese treatment facility that was started recently, and it's not slated to be completed until December 2025, won't address the PFAS issue. And it's been determined in their own report that blending doesn't eliminate the problem. Why I'm raising this is, without that well, the safe yield for the Heritage Village system goes from 21% down to 4%, well below the 15% required to be maintained. In the draft decision, the authority acknowledges that the company should report back to it on what it's going to do to address any division that is below the 15%, or going to be below the 15% in the future. And it says to do so in the next rate case. The Heritage Village residents can't wait for the next rate case. What I'm asking you here today is to require the company to file a report as soon as possible, whatever a reasonable period of time is, 60 days, 90 days, but something, because it could be an issue this very summer as to an adequate supply of safe drinking water at Heritage Village. And to do so, we know two things. One, they do have a connection with Middlebury that supplies, I believe it is 500,000 gallons a day. It's my understanding that that has capacity to provide more water. So the discussion should go on immediately to doing that. In addition, the company has a connection with Aquarian that has no agreement. It's not been used, but that should be explored also to meet the needs and demands until this situation more long-term can be borne out and remedied. So that is the issue that I probably want to focus on today. Otherwise, as far as rates, we're only asking to be treated the same as others, which means any increase would be across the board to Heritage Village as it is to the other 15 divisions, I believe it is, of the company. And that's all I have here on.
Thank you. What was that? Attorney Wyman.
Brittany Wyman for the Office of Education, Outreach, and Enforcement. EOE has nothing to add that we haven't heard today or said previously in our brief, so we just would like to thank the authority for the work that they put in for this decision.
Thank you, Attorney Wyman. Does the EOE have a position on the company's commentary on the proxy group issue from the written exceptions?
We do not. We support what we added in our brief and what we had in our testimony, but we do not have anything to add now.
All right, thank you.
Thank you.
Miss anybody? Attorney Bogan.
I'll just address a few of the comments. First of all, with regard to Attorney Minikowski's comments, with regard to the cost of capital, he suggests that the proposed decisions results are supported by the record, although the company would have preferred a different outcome. Well, he's right on the second point. We certainly would have preferred a different outcome. And we think you get a different outcome if the errors in the calculation are corrected. So it isn't simply a matter of arguing whether or not there's evidence in the record. We believe that the evidence was misapplied. That's all. And we think that if you go back and look, that will substantiate the statement that I just made. With regard to public act disallowances, it's a semantic issue. He says it's a going forward issue. I say, well, it's based upon test year expenses. So I disagree with his conclusion that the public act doesn't apply. I believe it does, and I believe that was the basis for the disallowance. With regard to the credit rating, Attorney Minikowski said this is yet another sad, sorry argument by the companies. He may believe that it's sad and sorry, but it's reality. It's the reality that people like Mr. Walters as the CFO and Mr. Danner deal with every day. They're dealing with rating agencies. And in fact, the evidence in the record supports the conclusion that an adverse ruling can affect the cost of capital to the company. We responded to an interrogatory, I believe it was either in our brief or our reply brief, where there was a reference to a debt offering last year, and the original interest rate quotes that we were getting were around 6.0%, and that was before the UI decision. And this is not a commentary on that decision or the Aquarian decision, but subsequent to that coming out, the actual cost of debt that was available to the company was at a higher rate. So it's just reality. It's not a sad, sorry argument. It's the reality in which these people deal every day. With regard to Willis Towers Watson, I just want to make sure that we're clear. I did not intend to concede there was no evidence in the record. The question that I believe you asked was whether or not the reference in the written exceptions were supported in the record. And I said, no, I don't believe they are. But I do believe there was adequate evidence in the record to support the expense. With regard to Attorney Nigro's comments with regard to the streamflow issue, the issue that we have is that she seems to be asking that the company go beyond the 8-year commitment that the company had made. The company is willing to pay its fair share, as referenced in the proposed decision. We don't believe we're the only user or one who benefits from those streamflow gauges. So we're willing to pay our fair share and recover that through an O&M expense.
I'm sorry, on that point, when you say pay your fair share, you mean that if the authority allowed that expense to be recovered in rates and then charged the other users the balance of the gauge? I'm just trying to, are you offering a cost sharing from the shareholders? Oh, I'm not quite sure what you mean by that.
Yeah, and I'm not sure how you get there, but I think what the proposed decision rightfully suggests is that the company is not the only one who uses those streamflow gauges. So if there's a way of figuring out who else benefits from that, well, okay, fine, but we don't think we should bear the entirety of the cost when we're not the only one who benefits from their existence. That's all.
Okay, so the appropriate way to interpret your sentence or your statement is not that the company is offering a cost sharing with its shareholders, but rather that you think it's okay for your ratepayers to bear a portion of the expense if we found a counterparty.
That is correct.
Okay,
That
thank
is
you.
correct. And then finally, just so that I'm clear, I think the chair understood, but I want the record to be clear. I believe that you asked as the final question of me last time whether or not the company was asking for the 5.4 million that's referenced in our written exceptions. The company maintains that its original amount was reflective of the prudent expenses and the cost going forward, including the cost of capital. But what we were all suggesting, and by way of my response, was at minimum, it should be the 5.4 million referenced in the written exceptions.
Thank you. I think you touched on most of the questions I was going to have in rebuttal, except does the company have a position on Attorney Dichter's suggestion that the reporting is something that should be more near term?
We certainly appreciate the concern that Attorney Dichter raises, but the company's position is it's not necessary to expedite the reporting requirement. We're currently in compliance with regard to PFAS and the process that has been set forth with regard to water quality, et cetera, already has reporting obligations, and we think those are sufficient.
Thank you. Okay, I don't
Thank you.
think I have anything further. Attorney Minikowski, please.
Thank you, Chairman. Regarding credit ratings, it's reality. It's reality for the company and its shareholders. There aren't ratepayers tossing and turning in bed at night worrying about what the credit rating of their water company is. And that's just reality. So let's get real here. You know, the credit rating gets downgraded. It costs a little more for the company. That's how business is done in this country. But as I said before in my previous remarks, there's other ways the companies can signal to its investors, to Wall Street, that it's a company worth investing in. It's not just the credit rating of a third-party agency, S&P or Moody's or whoever issues the credit rating at a time. And so, you know, really my concern here is the ratepayers. It's not whether the company's shareholders are worried about a credit rating that comes out. In regard to cost of capital, we've looked at the math. We've looked at the math the company has proposed as well. To the extent there is an error in calculation, again, never hurts to check your work. You know, if Pura goes back and looks at the numbers there and comes up with a different result, we've determined it wouldn't be very different from what's currently in the draft decision. I think it was about 12 basis points difference based on what the company had proposed. But obviously the OCC supports a decision that is accurate. So if the company, not the company, if the authority goes back and looks at its numbers and determines there's a different number that comes out at the end of that, you know, I don't think we would have a major objection should that slightly change in the final decision. In terms of the public act, sounds like company and the OCC just disagree. It's not the first time that's happened. There's multiple ways of reading a law. In regard to Willis Towers Watson, just to clarify, I was not saying there was zero evidence in the record, just saying that based on the representations that were made in the written exceptions of the company. We saw no basis for that in the record for those statements. I believe Attorney Bogan has clarified that, and I don't disagree with what he has represented in response to that. And I believe Consumer Counsel Clara Coleman would like to say something.
Good afternoon, Chair Gillette. Thank you for the indulgence. I know this has gone on a long time. I just wanted to reiterate my colleagues' sentiments that this is the proposed final decision is a strong and balanced decision, both in terms of the revenue requirement set and the rate of return, the return on equity set. With respect to the recent discussion on credit ratings, our office is not disagreeing that credit ratings are one component of the health of a company. And we do want strong, healthy companies that can obtain debt can go out and seek to borrow money at an affordable rate and understand the connection between the two. However, when you're looking at a fair outcome in a rate case decision and determining the appropriate level of revenue set, the outcome should be, what was demonstrated to be used and useful and prudently incurred. And when you compare the financial impact of a slight downgrade of a credit rating due to the fact that investors might be disappointed in a rate case decision to the day-to-day cost of supporting an increased revenue requirement that ratepayers are forced to support every day, that increased cost is much more impactful to ratepayers than if there was the result of a slight credit rating downgrade from the investor perspective. And to Attorney Minikowski's point, the authority's job is to determine, a revenue that is no more than sufficient for the company to recover its costs. So that is the legal requirement and what the proposed final decision has appropriately focused on and should maintain its focus on. So thank you. And thanks to all my colleagues for presenting strong arguments today. Again, we think this is a fair result that allows customers to receive affordable water. We think that addressing the needed PFAS investments in a generic docket outside of this case will assure that the company will, have a pathway to make the needed investments related to PFAS. So this decision does not have a negative impact on that, and we're, hopeful and supportive of the outcome will be one that balances affordability and quality of service in a right way. Thank you.
Thank you, Consumer Counsel. Attorney Wright.
I have no further comments. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Attorney Nigro.
Very briefly, while we appreciate the offer for the partial funding and believe that something is better than nothing, there currently exists no other sources for the funding, and partial funding may mean that we lose these valuable resources. With respect to something that was raised earlier, it may not be necessary for a RAM proceeding to order these funds that we believe the authority has the authority to put in the final decision that the water company can begin collecting on a certain date. But because the expiration date is in 2028, we were assuming that a RAM proceeding would take place prior to then.
Thank you. Attorney Dichter.
Madam Chair, I am appreciative and respectful of the company's position, but I just want to bring to your attention the submission of the company itself, so you're not taking just my word for it. With their filing, they filed the Project Summary Heritage Village Water Treatment Plan, reference document number 1. It's Exhibit A5, Appendix 1, and I'm looking specifically at page 75, where there's a paragraph called Risk Assessment. And it reads, The need for adequate water supply to meet demand with adequate margin of safety is not flexible. The high manganese levels in well 2A make it functionally unavailable for meeting supply needs. Supplying water from the well at levels periodically above action level and consistently above drinking water standards is not an acceptable risk. The maximum monthly average demand margin of safety falls from 21% with well 2A to 4% if it's unavailable. Those are the company's own findings. As such, operating that well is a health risk until it is treated properly for manganese, which was originally supposed to be May 2025, now it's December 2025, and now we have the PFAS issue on top of that. So I think it is incumbent upon the company to come forward with, if not a solution, at least an update on what it's doing to try and meet supply demands in the short run through other interconnections, increasing other well capacity, or whatever it may be. Thank you. You have any questions?
I do not. Thank you. Attorney Wyman. Thank you. Okay, I think that brings us to the end of our oral arguments. I do want to take a moment to acknowledge a few things before I cover next steps. So appreciate everything that has been said today. I want to be very clear about the use of the word adversarial to make sure that there is no misunderstanding. When we use the term adversarial as a definition in the Black Law Dictionary, I think it refers directly to having parties who advocate effectively different positions before an adjudicator, who is then tasked with adjudicating the best outcome for a case. I know there are other connotations to the word adversarial. Personally speaking for myself, I'm not adopting those other connotations and want to be very clear that the use of the word adversarial in the decision, in the draft rather, is a recognition that we simply have parties with different positions advocating effectively for different positions. So I appreciate everything that has been said today. I want to thank all of the parties and interveners for your zealous advocacy during this case. I want to take a moment for myself to say that the tone and the constructive engagement through today's oral arguments and written exceptions is an appreciated step. And I intend to take under advisement everything that was said here today, as well as the exceptions that were filed. And hopefully it was apparent that they have been read by myself and all members assigned to the case. So with that, just reiterate that we'll take those under advisement. As everyone knows, we are scheduled for a special meeting, which is Friday, June 28th at 10 a.m. So we will be issuing our decision then. So unless there are any administrative matters, we will be adjourning and we will see everyone back on June 28th. Thank you.
My friend's pretty active.